thank you to all for your short films and presentations. And so now we can really start the discussion. And as I mentioned at the beginning, shall we just very briefly start with one question to all the panelists. Do you see a difference between restitution and return? The two terms are used to describe our panel. One, restitution in the French, return in the English. Is that something that any of you would like to expand on?
Shall I start?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that in the Dutch language, we do not have that distinction. That's one.
Lucky you.
Yes, like in the German language. Now, in my English writing, I try to distinguish between return as a neutral concept, restitution as a concept based on a claim, and also repatriation if it is about human remains. And, you know, it's a very traditional distinction, but it's very helpful in my view. So that would be my answer.
Okay. Would anyone, I see Pierre, you have raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. I think the first time I started thinking about this, the possible differences among the three terms, because I would add repatriation into this mix, was actually based on one of the articles that I had read that you had written. So I'm really happy that we can discuss this today. For my own work, I think it became very important to think about the differences among different cases of such claims. I ended up focusing on returns, meaning for me claims that were not covered by any kind of international or national laws. And I think it's very useful to distinguish these cases as returns from restitutions as cases covered by existing laws. I think in English it makes a lot of sense because restitution is also a legal term that is employed for many different cases and not just concerning cultural heritage. And for me, returns are really claims in which a nation state is asking for the return of an object from the past. And that for me distinguishes restitution from a somehow non-problematic ask, because that ask would be covered by existing laws. Whereas in returns comes in the political dimension of the claim about an object that the claimant has no legal ground to ask. And so for me, it is important to distinguish the two. Oh, and also the difference with repatriation, because, and that leads to Donna and my presentation about demuseumification, because in return claims, state authorities are claiming the object, and local or indigenous communities, and I'm going to put quotation mark here, are not or seldom associated with the claims.
Thank you. Yeah, Donna, would you like to follow up on this? Yes.
I broadly agree and disagree with everybody. And to make matters worse, I'm going to throw another R word into it, recovery, which again, we're causing interesting problems. The way I tend to use return is to cover nearly everything. I see it as kind of the blanket term that covers the different type of R words below it. So generally, these are all giving objects, or in some cases, financial recompense, to put another R word. I blame French for these R words. The act of giving something back. And just because there is such fine detail separating these, and in the case of law, some very important differences separating these, I see return as the most blanket term, at least in English, that's currently possible, that covers most cases.
Anyone else to say something? Alexander, yes.
Yes, thank you also. And I agree with Donna and Pierre and Jules also. So being a German native speaker for me, so es ist auch die Rückgabe natürlich. But when we had this meeting with UNESCO in related to Yemen, we were early on actually also addressing the different terms that are being used here, and that these terms are obviously changing also throughout research. So I mean, this is something that we thought that at the end of with the discussions in Yemen also, it's not really helpful to have these discussions. And I agree with Donna so much here that it is the return really that I think is a term that we can easily agree upon, that is a very useful one. So, but the linguistic discussions here, I think they only lead us so far. So, I mean, and of course, I mean, people attack me because I'm not a lawyer also. I mean, I've never wanted to be a lawyer also. This was not in my interest. So I can only make my observations here based on those languages that I know. And what is coming, the baggage with these words also. Restitution for me has been in the last couple of years always used as restitution of knowledge more. And this is what I've been mostly through this project by Benedict Savoy and others. So that the restitution of knowledge, I think, where we do not speak about return, repatriation so much. So that's just my 5 cents.
Thank you so very much. So we're not going to deal more with this. It's just, I agree, we should not spend too much time on terms, but it's important to remember that sometimes, I've noticed this in my personal experience, you need to know when the person facing you is using a term with a particular underpinning, because then that might lead to avoiding misunderstanding if you can actually know what that person is thinking. But anyway, I would like to, well, I was going to ask Yasmina a question, but go ahead, Yasmina, you're going to add something. Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think everything is very important, but in this case, we are in the political context. Sometimes we use return to try to depoliticize the debate. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's very important to say, no, we have to speak about restitution because we have to repair something. And if it's just about the movement of an object from one place to another one, then we don't answer what the people want to hear. And what they want to hear is, I'm sorry about the past. So that's why I have to repair. I have to use the word restitution. So I think return is very, very important and practical, because we can speak about non-legal, not in a legal framework. We can speak about things without a bad context, but sometimes it's used not to admit that something bad is happening.
Thank you. So there again, we see that there is a yet another meeting that you have brought up. Now, I'd like to stay with you, Yasmina, because there is a question that has been asked to you. If you could give, so it's a little bit more personal, some explanations as to your mission relating to the report. This is coming from Damiana Otoyu, and who would like to know exactly what will this report serve as a basis for a future law? And if so, are you in charge of drafting it? I assume it is the report, not the law. And the second under question is, have you been helped by Belgian institutions, such as the MRAC or the royal family?
Yes, thank you for the question. I don't know, should I answer in French because the question is in French?
The question is in French. I translated it because I thought it might be useful, but
I don't know.
feel
Maybe...
free. Je pense que ça va très bien de répondre en français.
Ok. Donc, la mission, donc en fait, là, il faut vraiment un peu entrer dans le contexte belge. C'est qu'en Belgique, avant qu'il y ait la commission qui doit travailler sur le passé colonial et donner des réponses pour la réparation, il n'y avait aucune demande de travail sur la question de la restitution, sauf de la part de la communauté française. Donc, ça veut dire que ça ne concerne pas toute la Belgique, ça concerne une partie de la Belgique, c'est-à-dire Bruxelles et la Wallonie. Et eux ont demandé à l'Académie royale de Belgique d'écrire un rapport sur la question de la restitution. J'ai été engagée pour écrire un draft. Et donc là, donc pendant un an, d'octobre 2019 à octobre 2020, j'ai réalisé un rapport qui, on l'espère, permettra de créer une loi ou d'écrire une loi. Mais évidemment, cette loi ne pourra être qu'au niveau communautaire, sauf si, évidemment, le niveau fédéral s'y intéresse. Mais effectivement, il faudrait du coup aussi un rapport qui concerne les collections en Flandre.
Est-ce que le niveau fédéral s'y intéresse ou pas du tout pour l'instant?
Alors, le niveau fédéral s'y intéresse actuellement, depuis juin, à travers cette commission spéciale, qui est une sorte de commission parlementaire, mais on l'appelle spéciale, d'une mission d'un an, et là qui regroupe bien plus d'auteurs et de spécialistes que seulement dans mon cadre, j'avais un comité de suivi avec des spécialistes, mais disons que j'ai réalisé le draft et donc, je ne sais pas exactement quand le rapport va être rendu, parce que le comité de suivi donc, est en train de le modifier. Je ne sais pas, c'est un comité composé d'académiciens, donc de l'Académie royale de Belgique, qui sont spécialisés dans la conservation, dans l'archéologie, dans les relations diplomatiques. Donc, eux, ils y ajoutent encore des choses. Évidemment, le but, c'est de le publier pour qu'en Belgique, on ait aussi un rapport, comme il y en a un aux Pays-Bas, en France et en Allemagne. Et donc, j'ai été soutenue par des institutions comme elles ont pu m'aider, donc des musées qui se trouvaient à Bruxelles et dans la communauté française, enfin en Wallonie, notamment le musée royal de Marimont, les musées ont aussi contribué à ce rapport. Ils ont aussi eu un regard critique pour décrire leur collection et quelle était la partie des collections qui sont touchées par la restitution ou pas. Et alors évidemment, là c'est vraiment la raison pour laquelle en Belgique c'est un peu compliqué. Le musée royal d'Afrique centrale étant un établissement scientifique, c'est-à-dire un établissement qui relève des compétences du niveau fédéral, je ne parlais pas du musée royal de l'Afrique centrale parce que ce n'était pas un musée de la communauté française, donc ce musée n'est pas directement, sujet des politiques de la communauté française. Et ce qui est un peu absurde parce que écrire un travail sur la restitution en Belgique, mais exclure les collections du musée royal de l'Afrique centrale, ça pose un problème. Et c'est ça que je voulais montrer dans la présentation, c'est qu'en Belgique, du fait que le gouvernement soit fédéralisé, on arrive à des initiatives à des niveaux différents qui empêchent vraiment une réflexion à un niveau national et une politique qui pourrait effectivement arriver à l'écriture d'une loi. Voilà. Désolée d'avoir été un peu longue, mais c'est...
Non, mais la question amenait à un développement long. Merci, merci beaucoup. Ça montre la spécificité aussi de chaque pays. Perhaps we can move, because you also mentioned it, to Jos. Alexander is raising his hand, but maybe just before that, Jos, if you mind, we've spoken about the Belgian situation. The Dutch, you're not facing similar issues, but you're facing different ones. How far are you compared to the Belgians? Perhaps a little bit more advanced, right?
I don't like to say that we are more advanced than the Belgians.
Not in a negative way.
Operating differs. The Belgians are doing things usually more discreetly. We are more shouting, you know, look at us.
Okay.
Now, in my presentation, I spoke about this advice of the Dutch Council for Culture, and it's quite radical. They say it is really injustice. This injustice has to be made undone, and we have to do something. Now, the good news is that last Friday, the government of the Netherlands, they adopted the advice, which was quite unexpectedly. So in a way, we are a bit running forward, but we have been lagging behind a lot. So, you know, but yeah, what is happening in the Netherlands, it is interesting, but the point is that, you know, there's a lot of talk about it, but actual returns have been very limited. Like in 2020, there was only one return. I think Belgium had no returns. Germany had, I think, 3 returns. France had the one Sabre going to Senegal and a promise to the République de Benin, but since then it has been silent. So, you know, there is much talk and there is reason for optimism, but at the same time, I'm quite careful. And I know from my contacts in the Global South that they have very serious doubts about what we are doing.
Now, so the decision of last Friday, it's a political decision, right?
It's a political decision.
And what is the next step, if I may ask?
The next step is, well, that the parliament will accept it. And then, you know, what the museums will start proactively to research their collections.
Okay.
There will be some sort of a restitution committee comparable with the restitution committee for Nazi looted art. And former colonies, especially Indonesia and Suriname and the Dutch Antilles, they can submit requests for returns. And if it is war booty or if it was involuntary lost, so if they have broadened this definition, it's not only war booty, but it is involuntary losses, then they will get it back unconditionally, without any conditions. But if other countries, like, you know, in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, it has quite a number of objects from Sri Lanka, war booty. We have the Benin bronzes, of course. We have objects from Congo, in Rotterdam especially. Those are conditionally. And then the committee, the advisory committee, will look, you know, what is the interest of this object for the Netherlands and for the country of origin? Is the country of origin able to protect it and to make it accessible? And this is a bit sensitive thing, because I know that in Africa, they get upset about it and they will say, well, this is again paternalism, so that they are judging whether we are able to take care of the objects. So we have made a step forward, but there is still a lot of work to be done. And so far, almost nothing has gone back.
Thank you, Jos. Alexander.
Yes, I just wanted to briefly add also to Yasmina and Jos now. So the situation with the national museums, obviously, and private museums. So, I mean, this is a big issue also here in the US, where we have the Smithsonian Institution is actually, obviously, yeah, it's a government entity in some ways to a certain percentage. Just about the situation in France, also there's a wonderful short documentary that addresses also how government authorities are invested in the restitution for Yemen. There's a Yemeni filmmaker, Kadia Al-Salami, who made this documentary about this bronze man that was showing up in France and at the Louvre, was supposed to was then returned to the Sana Museum, and it's exactly, I think, addressing this issue. So just as a film documentary tip, perhaps, which for those who have not seen this movie.
Could you perhaps give the link if you have it? In the
yeah, I put it in the chat for everyone to see. So I hope it's yeah, there. Kadia.
Oh, great, great! I haven't seen it. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Right. Anyone else would like to comment on this particular issue? If not, I would move to an additional question that has been raised by Geoffrey Aloisi, who's asking what is UNESCO's role, in particular the Intergovernmental Committee for the Return as an intermediary for the restitution? So is the UNESCO the solution, or the question is UNESCO more the solution, or are we moving towards a more bilateral system in which, you know, states 2 by 2 get together and agree on a particular way of going? What would your views be? And I see Pierre's hand being raised. Thank you, Pierre.
En français ou en anglais?
La question est en français, donc on va faire peut-être cette règle-là. On répond en français si la question est en français, si on peut.
Alors, moi, je ne parle pas d'expérience, je n'ai pas travaillé à l'UNESCO. Je peux essayer de répondre à cette question à partir de ma propre recherche en Amérique latine, où j'ai été très surpris en fait de constater l'absence de l'UNESCO des processus de négociation sur les retours, qui s'explique en partie par un commentaire que Yasmina a fait dans sa présentation sur le fait que le droit n'est pas neutre. Et en effet, l'UNESCO n'a aucune compétence sur tous les cas qui couvrent des objets déplacés avant 1970. Donc à partir de là, ça limite beaucoup le champ des possibles de la part de l'UNESCO. Par ailleurs, sur le comité intergouvernemental en particulier, il y a tout simplement le fait que ce comité ne peut examiner que des cas dans lesquels les deux gouvernements acceptent de discuter dans ce forum particulier. Le fait même d'accepter une discussion implique d'une certaine manière que l'État possédant envisage une restitution ou un retour à l'issue de ce processus. Donc, si ce n'est pas le cas, il n'y a aucune chance, il n'y a aucune raison pour cet État d'accepter même le comité intergouvernemental comme forum de discussion. Et enfin, pour aussi utiliser un des arguments que Alexander vient de mentionner, dans de nombreux cas, les musées sont privés. C'est le cas notamment dans le cas des États-Unis. Et donc, l'UNESCO n'est tout simplement pas un forum parce qu'il faudrait que l'État membre prenne le cas à son compte. Il faudrait que le musée privé accepte que l'État parle en son nom au sein de l'UNESCO. Et tout ça est très peu probable. Donc, paradoxalement, parce que la convention de l'UNESCO de 1970 reste, je pense, un document de référence, même s'il est très imparfait, mais paradoxalement, l'UNESCO n'a pas un très grand rôle à jouer dans ces négociations.
Est-ce que tout le monde est d'accord? Alexander, yes.
Yes, I just can say in my case, the workshop that I've done with my Yemeni colleagues was organized by UNESCO. So there was Interpol was invited, ICOM was invited, and it was all financed by UNESCO. So without them, I would not have been able also to meet the colleagues from Yemen. So I agree also with Pierre in many ways. And of course, every institution has its own history. So as we now learn through many of the recent publications, UNESCO is not also as archives are opened, also we learn about who is involved in financial transactions also in the past in UNESCO. So I mean, there's much work to do here too. But as the face of this public face, I agree it is, and for me certainly in the case of Yemen, it has helped to be supported by UNESCO.
Okay, so we have 2 points of view. One in which we have UNESCO relatively in the backstage, one in which UNESCO is very much involved. Any other point of view there? Donna, would you like to say something on that? Or there you go. You're raising your hand.
Sure. Let's see how far I followed Pierre's French. I was just saying my French is at a high school level, but I think I understood, and I actually do agree with him. I think that UNESCO's role, and I think UNESCO would characterize their role as being, as Alex said, a bringer together, a creator of the forums where this discussion can happen. And my own impression of the Intergovernmental Committee for the very, very long name restitution, or whatever R word we're using for cultural objects. I've attended a few of those. They're very interesting, but they're a forum for mentioning cases, for gaining some publicity about it. But my own experience with return of objects is much like Pierre's, perhaps because we're looking at kind of the same corpus of Latin American materials, where UNESCO doesn't, there isn't really a space or a role in UNESCO in the negotiation of returns. And to look at the rest of Jeffrey's question, that it isn't even necessarily a bilateral agreement between states, where it's often a state and an institution that ends up making a decision and so on. So speaking at this like bigger state level on both sides, it's not necessarily there. So in a way, I agree with both of them. UNESCO plays a role, but it's more of this creating of a forum, not as a direct mediator in disputes. If anybody has a case where UNESCO was a direct mediator in a return dispute, do let me know. But this is not to criticize UNESCO, more just to kind of think of it as having a different role than direct mediator.
No, it's true. If you look at that committee, mediation was added as one option to be used about 10 years ago, and it's never been used technically. I mean, it's been used, yes, by Greece, but hasn't led anywhere because the UK has not agreed. So it's there, but it's actually not working. We have to just be clear about this.
Marc-André just would like to add something.
Yes, please, Florian.
Just your turn. You can take.
Joss, sorry, you were behind the question, Joss. Yes, Joss, go ahead.
Well, I'm not optimistic about the role of UNESCO. They really did not help, for instance, Sri Lanka in the 1980s with a very, very well prepared return requests. But I want to add another element to the discussion, and that's I want to refer to the Benin Dialogue Group.
Yes.
You know, between European museums and cultural authorities in Nigeria and some members of the Benin Kingdom. Now, they have been talking for a long while, not very successful. And in 2019, they have split off the aim of restitution. And they said it's a bilateral matter. Now, I remember that the Nigerians, they were quite disappointed about it because they said our purpose with the dialogue was restitution. But because of the changing atmosphere in Europe in relation to returns, it seems I expect that this year or next year, a number of individual museums, I think in Germany, in the UK, in the Netherlands, they will start returning Benin objects. That's the expectations. And I know that the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands, which has some 170 Benin objects, they have really prepared already the provenance research. And with the new policy of the Dutch government, it seems that they are ready to start really discussions. And then such a bilateral agreement is more effective. So I think in times of new atmosphere, bilateral agreements can be effective. And I'm sorry to say it, but UNESCO has not been very effective, be it in the past or present.
But how can we speak of bilateral agreements in the case of the Benin objects, because there are so many states involved? I mean, there's Benin, there's Nigeria on one side, but there's plenty of European states. So would you favor one bilateral agreement after another?
There's no choice. Of course, I would favor a Europe-wide agreement, but in these European museums, say on the one side is the British Museum, which is very stubborn, and on the other side, the more progressive ones. And I think it's an illusion to have Europe-wide agreement. So then it's better if several museums come up with bilateral agreements. And I also know from museums in the US and in the UK who are not in the Benin dialogue that they are preparing returns.
Okay.
So there's a little optimism.
Thank you. I think Yasmina has raised her hand.
Oui, sur cette question, c'est un peu étonnant de voir qu'il y a des conventions qui sont signées par de nombreux pays et puis qui n'apportent très peu de résultats. Mais dans les différents positionnements qu'il y a eu favorables à la restitution, on se rend compte que d'un point de vue moral, c'est important que ces conventions existent parce qu'on s'y réfère et que les pays sont censés les respecter. Donc, je pense que le rôle de l'UNESCO dans le contexte de la restitution ou du retour ne joue pas un rôle pratique, mais donne un cadre moral pour vraiment ancrer une position qui est presque mondialement partagée. Donc, je pense que c'est quand même quelque chose d'important. Si on n'avait pas ça, le positionnement favorable aux restitutions serait plus compliqué à tenir.
C'est difficile encore.
Marc-André, j'aimerais juste lire le commentaire de Saskia Cousin qui se réfère à une discussion que vous avez eue précédemment, mais qui peut revenir maintenant d'une manière intéressante. Saskia nous dit sur la discussion sur les termes, restitution, return, restitution, il est important de savoir d'où l'on parle, from where we speak. Au Bénin, on dit que les choses vont revenir. Il s'agit bien d'un retour. Voilà. Je partage les termes de Saskia.
Merci de nous dire ça. Très important de pouvoir savoir d'où l'on parle, effectivement, d'où l'on parle. Et si on sait, si on comprend, si on écoute d'où parle votre interlocuteur, ça peut beaucoup aider. Merci beaucoup à Saskia. Est-ce que sur ces questions, on these issues of UNESCO's role and bilateral agreements, anyone would like to say, touch the floor? Now, if not, we have a question to Jos, specifically regarding the 26,000 objects on Suriname in the Tropen Museum, most of them from Arawak. Would the objects returned to the Suriname be returned to the museum or to the indigenous communities? That's a tough one.
Yeah, and I'm very happy that the question is raised, and I would love to hear also the other panelists about it, because I think it's one of the most complicated questions we are dealing with. And this is an example from Suriname, but just the day before yesterday, there came an example from Indonesia, you know, which with the new Dutch policy get back certain royal objects which had belonged to a sultan. And the sultan and his groups around him, they have said, please keep them in the Netherlands, because if they will be returned, they will go to the National Museum in Jakarta. And we only favor a return if they come back to us, to the family or the regional museum. And for me, the problem is that, and the Dutch report, the Dutch government policy does not solve this issue. And I think we need an international conference about it, because the accusation, if we are going to say it should go to a regional museum, of the accusation of neocolonialism, neocolonial behavior will easily come. So we have to take care of that very carefully. And so I don't know the solution, but I think, you know, in many of these former colonies, there is internal colonialism. And that will be a next step. And if any of my colleagues here has a solution for this, please, please, please come up with it, because it's so complicated.
I think Donna Yates has the solution.
Thank you.
I certainly don't have any solution. I wanted to talk very quickly because I think Pierre actually has a lot to say what I'm about to say. But in most cases within Latin America, objects are not returned to indigenous communities. In some cases because they kind of can't be. To have one just a quick example, to go back to Bolivia, a very famous return case where a number of textiles that were illicitly trafficked into the United States, stolen from the village of Caroma in Bolivia in the 1980s, However, normally in Bolivia and by law, anything returned goes into the National Museum system and then is held by the National Museum system. When the textiles were returned, so that the textiles could be returned to Croma, there was actually a special exception law, a special decree passed in Bolivia that allowed these objects to be given to the Croma community. And that is a very special exception. So even within these states, it isn't so easy, even when it's very clear that this was stolen directly from a community. But I would imagine, again, something returned from the Netherlands to Suriname would go to the Surinamese state, and then the state would decide under their own laws and needs. But I wonder if Pierre can say a bit more about his experience with indigenous involvement in returns of cultural objects to Latin America.
Yeah, you were nodding, so perhaps you have more to say.
Yes, actually, all the objects that I studied in Latin America, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Peru were pre-Columbian objects. However, there was very little or most often no involvement at all from local or indigenous communities. And one characteristic common to all the cases that I studied is that these objects would only be returned if they were going to a museum. So for example, Yale, after more than 10 years of a dispute with Peru, agreed to return the collection of Machu Picchu objects to Peru, but only to a museum. It's not even clear that actually there would be a local or an indigenous community in this case that would want the responsibility of these objects. Another case also to mention textiles, as Donna did, the Museum of the City of Gothenburg in Sweden returned a collection of Paracas textiles to Peru. And the same, the return was only agreed upon after Peru could provide excellent conditions of care in one of the national museums in Lima. So there's always this, this paradox that even though we are talking about pre-Columbian objects, there is not necessarily an indigenous community interested in the case, and even less involved in it. I saw that happen a little more in Colombia, more than in Peru or in Mexico. Even though, and that's another paradox, state authorities will often mention repatriation laws, and I'm returning here to the differentiation among the three terms, but I've heard that a lot in Latin America, that if, for example, in the United States, there is a law called NAGPRA, that stands for North American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, this law forces federally funded museums in the United States to look at their collection and dialogue with indigenous communities about the fate of the objects. So Latin American state authorities often mention this law as in support of their own claim for objects that can be found in the United States or in Europe, when actually this is a completely different situation, because as Donna mentioned, it is a state asking for the return of objects that are considered part of the national heritage, whereas a law like NAGPRA actually considers the repatriation of objects to a local or an indigenous community and not to a state. Sorry if I was a little long here.
No, very interesting.
Can I add something?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, because there are two countries, and it's very interesting examples. It's New Zealand and Australia, in which the indigenous communities, especially in New Zealand, the Maori and Moriori communities, have been given preference in getting back the objects. And there is a perfect role division between the national government, which is financing the thing, the National Museum, which is doing provenance research and which is using its international network, and the communities of origin, which will become the owners, so to say, of the returned Maori tattooed heads. And they have been quite successful, because I think until now over 400 of those heads, they have come back from Europe and North America to New Zealand. And for the Aboriginals, the situation is getting comparable. So there are good examples in which indigenous communities play a major role in this whole return process.
And to jump in about New Zealand, also not just for human remains, but for returned objects, often the objects then enter into the ownership and possession of the correct iwi or Maori cultural group, but often in collaboration with local and regional museums. The local and regional museums house and preserve the objects, while the iwi retains ownership and access and various forms of control. So it is actually really quite ideal.
May I ask you, in your film, you mentioned a very interesting case about the Keiko. And it's been shown in the streets. What happened after? Do we know? Is it in a museum or is it somewhere?
Pierre said somebody would ask that question.
Well, there you go.
From what I understand, yes, it did enter the National Museum system, and it is preserved in a museum environment. Bolivia's museum professionals are museum professionals like the world over. The issue is just, it shouldn't have to be. It should be Bolivia's decision what happens afterwards.
Absolutely, yeah.
Exactly. So as far as anybody knows, yes, it's within the National Museum system, which again, by Bolivian law, it actually had to go into the museum system. But it's not necessarily within Bolivian law that it has to be preserved in a European sanctioned museum way, if that makes sense.
Meaning that it could also eventually go touring in the streets again.
Yes, the fine curators and museum professionals there could say that this is the right thing to do, and then there you go. Or, I mean, in theory, well, no. I was going to say, in theory, it could really enter into some sort of more modern and maybe more destructive use. But I think even in Bolivia, that would be a bit edgy.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked the question that you were expecting. Anyone else on all these very interesting and
I see Pierre has more to say.
Yeah, Pierre, yes. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Just to add briefly on this, I think that part of the issue, not the issue, the question stems from the fact that the return process is controlled by museum people. And I understand that, of course, from their perspective, the idea, for example, when textiles are returned, the textiles I'm talking about in the case of the Paracas sculptures, they were funerary bundles. So they were unearthed and they were wrapping mummies. So of course, from a museum person perspective, I can see how the idea of reburying such a textile is very difficult to fathom, because you're losing the object that will allow you to continue your research or to show these objects to audiences. However, I do think that from again, different epistemological perspectives, we need to consider whether this is always the right decision, whether out of respect for past cultures, past or present for that matter, cultures, we need to consider whether there can be other ways or other uses of this kind of objects upon their return to their country and or community of origin.
Alexander?
Yes, I just want to briefly add and introduce one case study related to Yemen, where in 2011, the US authorities actually, they caught objects from Middle East, and they repatriated this to Egypt, where clearly on the photographs, this is Yemeni material. So there's an issue here also actually of knowledge production and of knowledge imbalance also. One, I wanted to mention this case earlier already, but we do not teach here also students in South Arabian art. So, I mean, it's probably the same with Donna and Pierre. There's not so much knowledge here that is being shared also. And so who makes then even in these governments these decisions? So when I saw this, I tried to figure out how did this happen. So we need to follow really the knowledge also that is here produced and going back and forth then also. And so this is why I think the whole restitution of knowledge really is a very important discussion that we need to continue here, at least on the US side. This is my experience here with the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Actually, I would have a question to you, Alexander. It's not directly connected to what you just said, but a little bit. There is here in Geneva an object that clearly comes from Yemen, which was part of illegal trade, illicit traffic, came to Geneva via the Emirate States, and has now been ordered to be returned by the public prosecutor here in Geneva. It's sitting here now for several years. Do you know if authorities in Yemen are proactive in wanting to obtain the whatever of the object back or not? And could something be done, or do they prefer to wait and see?
No, they are actually proactive. So the workshop that UNESCO, again, to pay honor here to the organization which made this meeting happen, the Yemeni colleagues were very clear. They laid out case studies also, after which current museum they are going. There is not only in Switzerland, in Lebanon, in the Gulf states, there are places where Yemeni objects are housed. So obviously right now with the situation of the government in Yemen, this is the tricky thing here also, because we have so many different parties involved now who all claim we are the caretakers here. That's why it's also the whole narrative creation here about the Houthis are the bad ones. So this is in the case of Yemen, one group that is always being attacked here. This is not the reality, but there are organizations even here in the US who make just single groups responsible for looting and for stealing. And obviously then they have no chance also. There are, even among those in Sana'a, where the Houthis are currently the people fighting for the return of antiquities. So I mean, this is these myths here that are being also created of just single groups always responsible for theft, destruction. And this is particular in Yemen, where we have the bombing of the museums did not occur by local terrorists. This was clearly Western produced. So, these are all going together, I think.
Thank you very much. Time is running. So I don't, is there any, I see something here. Well, actually, this is exactly what I was thinking. I think I shall conclude, which is also suggested by the organizers. Thanking everyone, thanking the, 70 participants for their very, I hope, interested listening and for their questions. Thanking you all and congratulating the organizers. So now I'll give the floor to Florian, Claire, and Olivier, So I'll let you decide who has the final word among the three organizers.
Merci Marc-André, merci d'avoir modéré ce panel très intéressant. We thank you all for your participation. We are very sad of the ending of our conference. It was a lot of work, but we're very happy about all those exchanges, and we hope there will be, you know, other meetings, other exchanges like that, and then a very, very important network to be built. So I will let now Claire and give us a conclusion for the whole conference. Thank you so much.
C'est pas vraiment une conclusion, c'est juste pour revenir sur quelques pensées. Et avant cela, je voulais remercier tout le monde, le comité scientifique, les panélistes, les modérateurs, ainsi que tous les participants qui ont été très actifs et qui ont posé de nombreuses questions et qui ont permis de riches débats. Brièvement, je voulais revenir sur quelques réflexions qui m'ont marquée. Déjà, je voulais rappeler que la recherche en provenance n'est pas une pratique nouvelle. Elle a été longtemps pratiquée sous le nom d'histoire des collections, mais elle a pris un tournant plus politique dès les années 70, tournant qui perdure encore aujourd'hui, on l'a vu grâce à toutes ces discussions. À travers ces 6 webinaires, nous avons pu traiter du sujet tant d'un point de vue de la méthodologie, de la pratique, de la mise en exposition, de la mise en visibilité, que d'aspects juridiques, comme on a encore fait là maintenant. Et chacune des discussions a été enregistrée et sont disponibles en ligne. Ça, je voulais vous le rappeler pour ceux qui ont manqué certains webinaires. Je voulais aussi revenir sur le fait que dans le fil de discussion, on a eu beaucoup de questions sur la restitution. Le mot est revenu de manière assez récurrente. Il est revenu aussi dans ce dernier webinaire et on a pu avoir des éclaircissements sur les différents termes. Et je tenais aussi à rappeler aussi la remarque de Saskia Cousin qui nous rappelait que selon l'endroit où on se trouve, on utilise différents mots. Et j'espère que toutes ces discussions au cours des webinaires auront un peu un effet de désacraliser l'acte de restitution et de décrisper un peu les esprits sur le sujet parce qu'on sent qu'il y a toujours parfois des réticences et que ce n'est pas encore acquis. On retiendra aussi, comme l'a soulevé Emmanuel Casarero, que la recherche de provenance est un travail de fond qui est souvent mis à l'écart au profit du discours politique et diplomatique sur les restitutions. Enfin, on retiendra également que le rapport Sarr-Savoie n'est qu'un exemple parmi d'autres. Aujourd'hui, dans ce dernier webinaire, on l'a rappelé, il y a des projets aux Pays-Bas, en Belgique. Il a été, dans le webinaire de ce matin, ce rapport a été aussi assez critiqué. On rappelle qu'il pointe une aire géographique et une typologie de patrimoine, finalement, et qu'il exclut les autres, c'est-à-dire qu'il exclut l'archéologie, il exclut les patrimoines naturels et d'autres encore. Pour revenir encore au webinaire de ce matin, il y avait une chose intéressante concernant la décolonisation, question à laquelle les panélistes ont dit préférer utiliser l'expression « travail décolonial », qui pour eux est moins utopique et plus réaliste et qui nous invite à être beaucoup plus humbles, pour reprendre les mots des panélistes. Et enfin, je voulais revenir sur quelques mots-clés qui ont été énoncés, qui proposent en fait des perspectives pour l'avenir. Le Sustainable Museum, le musée responsable et la démuséification qui peuvent voilà, être des choses à rediscuter à l'avenir. Je vous remercie encore pour votre participation et je laisse peut-être la parole à Floriane et Olivier s'ils ont des pensées à rajouter.
Pas de pensée particulière, vraiment pour remercier encore une fois l'ensemble de nos panélistes. L'ensemble de nos panélistes d'avoir été là, les modérateurs et toutes les personnes présentes. Nous avons été très suivis en fait pendant tous ces différents webinaires. Ça montre vraiment que toutes ces questions autour de à la fois la recherche en provenance, les questions de restitution sont vraiment très fortes en fait aujourd'hui et suscitent beaucoup d'intérêt. Personnellement, je reste un peu toujours avec cette grande question de savoir si ça intéresse, enfin de quelle manière ça intéresse finalement les communautés sources dont on a essayé d'avoir des représentants ou des personnes qui parlaient en leur nom, ou d'essayer de comprendre véritablement où se situaient les enjeux en dehors, on va dire, des musées, mais véritablement dans les communautés sources. Et je pense que c'est peut-être un des enjeux encore actuels et ça pourrait être l'objet d'un prochain webinaire où on essaye véritablement de comprendre jusqu'à quel point les musées aujourd'hui occidentaux répondre à leurs propres questions, ou essayer de répondre à leurs propres questions, mais ou répondre à des questions qui viennent véritablement de l'extérieur. Bref, encore toute une série de discussions intéressantes qu'on pourrait avoir ensemble. Voilà, je ne sais pas si Florène, tu veux rajouter quelque chose, sinon je fais moi un signe de la tête. Voilà, peut-être je conclue alors au nom de toutes et de tous. C'était vraiment un immense plaisir. Le format virtuel a aussi parfois quand même quelques côtés positifs. Nous avons eu des intervenants du monde entier pendant ces quelques jours. Merci pour tous et à une prochaine.